Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on electric rate modernization in North Carolina. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Cece Maurer, and I'm the Engineering Manager with Advanced Energy. I'm happy to serve as the moderator of today's discussion. Today's webinar is part of Advanced Energy's Exploring North Carolina Smart Grid program. Advanced Energy is a nonprofit energy firm founded in 1980 that provides research, testing, training, consulting, and program design. Since 2017, our team of technical and training staff have collaborated on this Smart Grid webinar series in order to provide stakeholders with a convenient option to learn how Smart Grid is changing North Carolina's future. Before we dive into today's presentations, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, at any point, if you would like to interact with us, please submit your questions or comments in the Q&A box in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. We will respond to as many of your questions as we can at the end of the program during the open question and answer session. This webinar is also being recorded and will be shared with everyone that registered. Lastly, following the webinar, there will be a participant satisfaction survey. Please take 2 minutes to complete the survey to help us improve our webinars in the future. Today's webinar will cover upcoming considerations and challenges around rate design, strategic initiatives and pilots in North Carolina, and examples of how other states are reforming their approach to rate making. We have a packed agenda today with 4 speakers. First, we will hear from Kara Goldenberg. Kara is a manager with Rocky Mountain Institute's electricity practice. She focuses on regulatory policy reforms and changes to the utility business model needed to support the integration of clean and distributed energy resources. Next, we will get some perspective from Lon Huber, Vice President at Duke Energy. Lon is tasked with the development of new, innovative electric rate designs in all jurisdictions of Duke Energy. He will share pilot programs and trends related to these initiatives. Then we will hear from Jack Floyd of the North Carolina Utilities Commission Public Staff. Jack has been with the public staff for 25 years, with 17 of those in the electric division, now the energy division. He will share perspective on current considerations in North Carolina. We will end today's prepared remarks with Heather House with Rocky Mountain Institute. Heather is currently working on an effort to help U.S. cities procure renewable energy and decarbonize their electricity supplies. She is a lead for the North Carolina Energy Regulatory Process, a continuation project to follow up on recommendations in the Clean Energy Plan developed under North Carolina's Executive Order 80. I'm so grateful to be joined by our panelists today. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the presentation to Kara Goldenberg to share information about potential changes to utility business models and examples of reform in other states. Kara, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Cece. As Cece explained, hi, I'm Kara Goldenberg, and I work with RMI's electricity practice. I've been focusing on performance-based regulation, otherwise known as PBR, for the last several years, both working directly with utility regulators in different states and also producing research on the topic. So today I am going to provide a brief overview of sort of why states and utilities are exploring PBR, what the more popular components of PBR are, and also a brief overview of how different states are pursuing PBR in their jurisdictions. So first here, for those of you who may be less familiar, I'm going to start with how utilities have historically been compensated and incentivized in the past. And it's important to note here that this is for investor-owned utilities. And most of sort of how we've regulated utilities revolves around this equation, which defines what we call the cost of service model. This, of course, is not the equation that states use in terms of trying to figure out how to compensate utilities, but is a simplified model that really captures some of the major components of that business model equation. As you can see here, operational expenses such as fuel and purchase power and taxes are what we consider a pass-through to ratepayers, meaning that these costs are passed through to customers directly through rates. Capital expenses, on the other hand, such as grid infrastructure or power plants, get added into what is called here the utility rate base. And something that you'll notice in this second box here is that everything that goes into the rate base receives a rate of return. So by virtue of this equation, utilities are incentivized to build things, right? Which was very useful when our objective was universal electrification, and it resulted in the build out of the robust electricity system that we have today. And this is all summed up to what we call the revenue requirement, or how much money the utility needs to collect from ratepayers in order to pay the expenses, pay the taxes, and earn a rate of return for shareholders. Rates are then determined using this revenue requirement. However, how much revenues the utility collects depends on how much energy they sell, right? Which may be less or more than what was determined by this revenue requirement equation. And so there are a few things implicit in this equation I think that it's important to point out. One is that as the utility increases, the utility can increase revenue by increasing sales of electricity, and we call this the throughput incentive. And it becomes problematic when we think about things like energy efficiency or customer-sided distributed energy resources, other programs that might reduce electricity sales to customers. The other is that there's not really an incentive to reduce expenses or what goes into the rate base. Also, there is a goal here, and it's important to point this out, that there's a goal to keep the utility solvent, right? So as a regulated monopoly, as an essential public service, in order to keep rates low, we believe that utilities needed this access to low-cost financing. And investors are attracted to guaranteed rates of return, which you can see right there in that second box. So, many things have changed in the electricity system, though, since we designed that equation. One is that utilities are facing new expectations from customers, from different parts of the industry, from public policy. There are no new needs on the grid. And all of these factors weren't really considered when we were thinking about how the utility should be compensated back in the day. And as a result now, utilities face many limitations in meeting those new demands and meeting those new expectations brought on by that traditional business model. There's that CapEx incentive, which means that utilities are still incentivized to build tangible assets. This then limits how they might earn revenues and profits, and therefore what is palatable to shareholders. The design of traditional regulatory processes also has been a limitation. A lot of these processes tend to be somewhat adversarial, somewhat highly legal, sort of prohibiting some of the more collaborative dialogue needed to innovate and come up with new ideas to solve these new challenges and really take advantage of the new opportunities in the electricity system today. Also here, I would like to note the sort of traditional rate design has also been a challenge, and I believe my fellow presenters are going to touch on some new solutions that folks are working on that will be interesting for you all to learn about. So some of the objectives of performance-based regulation, or PBR, are therefore to reduce these barriers, right? To provide the incentives to utilities to meet these new expectations, to meet these new demands, and to meet the new objectives arising from public policy and the public interest. It's also worth noting here that PBR is not the only conversation, right, or the utility business model reform is not the only conversation going on here in power sector modernization, right? It can complement other approaches and strategies as well, such as new, tariff or rate design, new ways to compensate DER energy that's exported. It can complement various new planning and grid modernization efforts and the like. It really is a means to a lot of different ends. And so now I'm going to go through some of the more popular components that we see utilities and states using under the PBR toolkit. So first here we have decoupling. And decoupling can really be thought of as sort of a foundation for the other PBR mechanisms. Decoupling is focused on breaking that link between the energy the utilities deliver and the revenues they collect. So while revenue requirements are still set to cover costs and earn that return for shareholders, customer rates are then adjusted so that collected revenues at the end of the day equal what the utilities are allowed to collect. So decoupling then, of course, is primarily focused on removing that throughput incentive I discussed earlier. By decoupling utilities' recovery of their fixed costs from their sales. And removing that incentive can result in greater investments in energy efficiency. It also provides a more stable inflow, so utilities may be more inclined, stable inflow of revenue, so utilities may be more inclined to support innovative programs or new procurement approaches that can support clean energy investment. And you can see here that decoupling is quite widespread in the U.S. already. As of February of this year, over a third of the states in the U.S. And almost 50 utilities have implemented decoupling for electricity revenues. So building off decoupling, several states have also authorized multi-year rate plans for their utilities. And this map here from 2017 shows where multi-year rate plans are in place and have been used for both electric and gas utilities. Instead of annual rate cases, regulators set utility revenues for multiple years in advance, usually around 3 to 5 years. It's common for these starting rates in multi-year rate plans to be based off of a forward test year, or looking ahead to forecasted expenditures instead of a previous year's cost. These base rates then may need to escalate in the interim between rate cases, and that can be done in a number of ways. However, the objective of multi-year rate plans is to drive utility cost containment by allowing utilities to keep some savings from keeping their costs below what those revenues are set to be. Multi-year rate plans can also reduce the regulatory burden by avoiding the time and resource-intensive rate cases every year. But what do multi-year rate plans actually do for clean energy, right? So just establishing a multi-year rate plan will not directly result in more clean energy on the grid. However, they can and should be accompanied with other policies, with other regulations that in tandem can support clean energy objectives. they can provide that utility revenue certainty, right? So for a number of years, which can allow them more flexibility in perhaps resource and system planning, in their grid mod investments as well. Multi-year rate plans should be supported by targeted performance incentives, which I'll get to in the next slide. These performance incentives can ensure that the utility's service quality or other important utility programs are not necessarily negatively impacted by cost reductions from the utility. And I'll get into performance incentives in this next slide right here. So PIMs, or performance incentive mechanisms, are designed to reward and or penalize utility performance in achieving specific objectives or regulatory outcomes that are in line with public interest. These objectives or outcomes can be informed by state policy, customer demands, or desired changes to utility operations. There are many ways that PIMs can be structured, right, in terms of the type of reward or penalty they deliver. One of those options is what we call shared savings mechanisms. And so they're a common type of PIM. We're seeing them used more and more throughout the country. And in that model, if a utility is able to reduce their expenditures compared to a baseline, they are allowed to retain some of those savings as profit. So it's a way to get utilities to reduce costs, but also achieving whatever outcome that they are set up to achieve. So for example, shared savings mechanisms have been used to incent utilities to enter into renewable PPAs with a third party if those are lower cost than what the utility would build itself. Energy efficiency is one of the most common outcomes that we see PIMs being used for across the U.S. PIMs also have been used historically for more traditional service obligations of the utility, so thinking about sort of reliability and safety. But what we're seeing today, which is really interesting, is that PIMs are being used for more emergent outcomes. So there's states like Rhode Island and New York, Minnesota, that are exploring how performance incentives and performance metrics can support DER utilization, can support improvements to the DER interconnection process, even lower peak demand, things of that nature. So now in my last few minutes, I'm just going to provide sort of a brief overview of a couple of states. And so here you see two processes set up by, that are underway in Hawaii and Minnesota. And so you can see here that these two processes, the origin and how they are initiated, they were started in two different ways, right? So in Hawaii, the PUC really launched the process, the PBR process that's going on, and in Minnesota, the commission actually opened up a proceeding after Xcel, the major investor-owned utility in Minnesota, filed a multi-year rate plan, and the commission decided that it needed to sort of expand that multi-year rate plan to include additional PBR mechanisms like performance metrics. Other states like Nevada and Colorado are also exploring PBR right now. They were directed by legislation and are directed by legislation as well. So there are sort of several different ways that states might get started down this journey. And so you can see here that the PBR processes underway have different goals, right? So Hawaii is really comprehensively looking at how the utility business model, how the full regulatory framework in the state might be adjusted and might be realigned so that it's closer to public interest and the policy goals that the state has. So they're looking at new rules for multi-year rate plans, new PIMs. They already have decoupling, but they're looking at all of these mechanisms together. Whereas Minnesota is taking a more incremental tack or wants to track performance metrics and then see if those metrics evolve into what we call performance incentives, so that putting actually a dollar sign to those performance metrics. So Minnesota's process is really focused on that mechanism or that element of PBR. Minnesota also has decoupling and multi-year rate plans, but the process they've set up is more narrowly focusing on the performance mechanisms tool in the toolkit. Other state processes like Nevada and Colorado are earlier on in their sort of journey through PBR and are really investigating whether or not those states are interested in pursuing PBR and thinking about sort of the trade-off and how that their current regulatory systems may be updated. And the last thing I want to touch here is sort of the process approach. As I said in the beginning of this presentation, the regulatory process has a big impact on the results of these types of new proceedings. And so states are looking to sort of more collaborative stakeholder workshops, stakeholder working group meetings in order to ensure that stakeholders are sort of working together and putting their minds together to create these new mechanisms and regulatory frameworks. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Lon, who can provide a bit more information on what Duke is doing these days.
Great. Well, thanks. And again, Lon Huber, Vice President of Rate Design and Strategic Solutions. As of last week, I've been with Duke for about a year, so it's been fun. Prior, I was a consumer advocate and a consultant working across the U.S. on regulatory modernization, pricing, renewables, and energy storage, so all the fun things. So again, thanks for joining today. I've got some really fascinating topics that I want to cover, and I only have about 15 minutes, so I'm going to jump right in. So really, technology is quickly removing cost constraints on customer-sided solutions that have plagued the energy industry for decades. And this is especially true for data collection and rate design. In the not-too-distant past, to enable a new rate design, you've actually had to roll out a truck and swap the meter for the customer. And to collect data on any widespread scale, you have to use load research meters. We've made a lot of progress with our AMI deployment of capturing this data cost effectively, cleaning it, validating it, processing it, and turning that raw data into information. And we're really just at the beginning stages. My job is to figure out how to use rate design and customer programs and data to solve system challenges and facilitate a clean energy future. So what I'm going to try to do is take you through a use case and sort of a case study, I should say, that illustrates just what we can do with some of these new technologies. First, to set the stage a bit, these technology advances could not have come at a better time because managing the power on the grid is becoming more and more complex. And this is due to a variety of factors, extreme weather, load changes, renewable energy adoption, and so forth. And a big barrier to a more reliable clean energy system is extreme weather-induced peak demand days. And what we're seeing is a shifting of our highest loss of load probability hours to the winter. And one has to build the entire system just to meet these peak days. And it limits also the ability to integrate renewables if those peak days and hours are happening when the renewable energy isn't there. So these are crucial hours to try to tackle. So the case study I'll go through will show how we can use advances in data and meters to tackle this issue with clean resources and behavior. But first, we have to understand our system and the customer. And so you can see from this chart that residential customers really do drive that winter peak. There's a little bit with commercial customers. Industrial is pretty steady, but residential is really where it's happening. So what I wanted to do is go beyond just that load shape that you just saw and think about, what can we glean from all this great AMI data coming in. So I directed the construction of an analytics dashboard that integrates AMI data with a variety of different demographic overlays that you can change and mix and match. It can be number of people in the household, the type of technology used for heating, housing stock, you name it. So really, these are going to be some early results. This is pretty hot off the press tool that was built. But let's see what this dashboard can tell us about customers and insights into winter peak. So first, what type of residential customer drives winter peak? That was my first question. And I started with an overlay of income. Does income level impact a load shape from a customer? And for the most part, you really don't see much difference between different income levels. But let's dive in a little bit more. Maybe I'm missing something, right? And really, it bears out that income does not create a huge difference in usage. There's a slight statistical significant difference in median usage. But in some strata, the LMI customers actually use more electricity than the average customer, right? So income really isn't driving differential in load shape. But maybe it could be income level by housing type, right? Maybe it's single family homes. And so you can see there's a little bit of variation there from average, but there's probably more to the story. What about the single family home makes it a little bit of a driver? And could it be the age of that housing stock? And here you can start to see the overlay with age of the type of housing. And you can see more of that split between that average customer. And some of this makes sense, right? The bottom layer is a 2010 and newer, which makes sense. Those are going to be very efficient homes. But you also see a 1975 to 1989 housing stock that is very high. And it sort of doesn't make sense, right? Like the 1950s are more efficient homes, and then these newer ones constructed in the 70s and 80s over that 15-year period. So we wanted to dive in, and with this tool, we were able to find that time period, that 15 years, had by far the highest amount of electric heat adoption for new builds than any other time period. So that's what's driving that winter peak, right? Now, let's go even a step further. We covered age, but what about property type? And here you can see that mobile homes are a pretty high user during that winter peak time period. And again, you're seeing more variation in these lines. And then followed by single family homes and then other, apartments and condos. Now, let's combine everything that we just saw and look at that housing stock from 1975 to 1989, overlaid here by the type of housing. And you can see that single family home line is just as high, if not higher than the mobile home housing stock. So again, if we want to develop great programs, the best bang for the buck for rate design, right, and demand reduction would be these property types, right, and focusing on enabling technologies and price signals to reduce demand in the winter, because there's a lot that can be done. So that's not all. Those are just general load shapes given a certain demographic. But we can also go underneath that load shape and figure out what individual appliances are actually driving that winter morning peak through AMI disaggregation. And so we did this for a winter peak study, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And we're finding, to no surprise, that heating with that heat pumps is the primary driver, and everything around that from fans and so forth. When water heating only represents about 10%, and then other appliances around 20%. So pretty interesting how that all breaks down. Okay, so I mentioned that winter peak study. I brought on some of the nation's top experts from around North America to see what we could do with customer-sided resources to tackle peak demand as soon as possible. And we started by looking at what technologies customers are already adopting that we could leverage, some quick start opportunities that we could get in the market right away. And this report isn't final yet. It's about to be, but on that quick start opportunities, we identified a winter peak bring your own thermostat program, and we filed that right away. It was approved in North Carolina, and it's pending approval in South Carolina as we speak. So to show that we're really looking for things we can deploy quickly. We also looked at leveraging current programs and then creating a long-term strategy and framework for future programs. And what is really interesting in the findings is that the potential modeling is showing that rate design in combination with technology can lead to sizable peak demand reduction. So it's sort of one thing to say that rate design can help, but can it really do that in practice? Do we have actual learnings from our customers? And thankfully, we do. And it was from the winter. So we initiated a lot of, or we kicked off a lot of different rate design pilots that looked at sending dynamic pricing events to customers during those high peak days that I mentioned before. And we found some really strong behavioral changes to those rate designs from 7 to 20%, nearly 20% on those event days. In non-event days, we still saw a statistically significant load reduction from around 4.5% to 8%. So really promising results from these rate designs to show that customers understood them and they responded to them. We also found that customers with smart thermostats had higher impact, higher peak demand reduction. And so this is sort of a breakdown of what that looks like from a load state standpoint. So you can see a substantial reduction there. The TOU looks a little bit less, but it's not. The customers actually adjusted their behavior to respond to the TOU. So when there was an event day, they still responded, but there was less to respond to because they've already sort of set their energy usage to respond to the underlying rate. All right. So what about mixing rate design with rooftop solar? We saw that it worked with the smart thermostats from the pilot results that I just showed you. But what about more sophisticated technology? And as many of you may have heard, Duke, in close partnership with a variety of stakeholders, such as NCSEA, Vote Solar, Sunrun, et cetera, we put forward a next generation of net metering in South Carolina, but it's geared for the Carolinas in general. There's about 4 different major components to this new rooftop solar modernization. It starts with proper cost recovery, making sure that solar adopters still contribute to crucial public benefit programs. This could range from some low-income programs to storm recovery, cybersecurity, and so forth. And also that the enabling grid infrastructure that facilitates the net metering transaction is covered, and we did that through a $30 minimum bill. Next, we create a static TOU rate that sends more granular price signals, but with a bit more certainty for the customer so they can set their behaviors right. And then on top of that static TOU, we have dynamic pricing events that, again, are meant to target those crucial days in the winter and summer that drive that peak demand. And finally, we have a connection between the solar and dispatchable resources, which I'll get into later. But the foundation of everything is that static time of use rate. And you can see we structured this to really ensure we're hitting what's called net. So gross peaks less must-take renewables, and focus on our highest loss of load probability hours. So we used a 2025 forecast to forecast adoption of new resources, so we don't have to go and redesign these just in a few years. So it's more of a durable rate design. And we made sure to focus in at those high peak hours but in a way that customers can respond. And this would also align price signals between the different utilities, DC and D. What we're really excited to announce, though, is a concept called Solar Plus as part of the settlement package. It essentially enables a 1 + 1 = 3 type of transaction by linking dispatchable resources to that solar PV. And we're going to be starting with smart thermostats and then moving into battery storage and other controllable devices that yield around 1 kW or above in that winter morning. So this is pretty exciting. If a solar adopter participates in that dispatchable DR program, then they will be eligible for an energy efficiency incentive of around 36 cents a watt. Of course, this would have to pass cost effectiveness tests and would incur the same treatment as today's EE measures. But we're really excited to start pairing new technologies with solar PV to create a more holistic resource that can bring system-wide benefits to all customers. So at the end of the day, we need widespread customer adoption of new rates and product bundles to help solve the winter peak challenge. And to me, it starts with having a robust suite of price options that can unlock value for both the customer and the system. So in general, we need to offer options that give customers the choice between control, risk, price, and their goals. So they can figure out what's most important to them and balance between all those different factors. And Jack is up next, and he's going to talk about how we can set up a process and methodologies to really do just that. So I'll turn it over to Jack now. Jack, take it away.
Thank you, Lon. I appreciate that. I am Jack Floyd, Manager of Rates and Energy Services for the public staff. We are the consumer advocate in front of the Utilities Commission, representing the using and consuming public. The lawyers require me to put a disclaimer on the slide to at least identify that what I say today may not be necessarily what the public staff ends up presenting in front of the commission, but in terms of our discussion today, what is said is likely to at least make its way into some consideration before them. But what I wanted to do is kind of give an overview of why we need to modernize rates. And I'm not going to read these slides literally, but I do want to highlight some things that have been driving force behind this effort. We've had 13 cases since 2007 with the 3 investor utilities that are regulated by the commission since 2007, and it's been a very busy time for the public staff in dealing with those cases. But as a result, there really hasn't been much change in rate design over the decades. Most of what we have today are still designs that were developed in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. We've seen changes to rates in terms of across-the-board changes, but no meaningful structural changes. We've seen rate designs, some have been new rate designs implemented over the years, but they have been done to address very specific areas of service. And one of the concerns is that sometimes when we look at something in such a specific way, we tend to lose sight of what the bigger picture is and what happened. And then the last point is that we've had inadequate metering to be able to look at the more granular aspects of utility service. And as Lon mentioned, that's starting to change. AMI data, advanced metering infrastructure data, is giving a new insight to how the system is being used. the analytics that are provided by that, as Lon mentioned with his new rate analysis tool, is helping the companies to look at load shapes, see what's happening, and to start identifying how cost of service and rate design needs to change. I'll give you some examples of things that have changed. You know, we've seen lighting move to more LED, more efficient lighting. We've seen the new time of use pilots that Lon mentioned, and I always like to cite the cooperative nature that we developed through the discussions around Duke's OPTV, which is a non-residential time of use structure that brought together commercial and industrial customers as a way to go about looking and addressing rate design questions. We're looking at new services coming around, whether it's electric vehicles, storage. Some places are looking at microgrid services, the distributed generation that we're seeing in various forms and fashions. These are all things that are causing changes in the utility service. We're looking at, excuse me, we're looking at new cost drivers. And this is probably where the public staff has spent a lot of time investigating. Grid modernization is a large dollar investment. Coal ash cleanup, the governor's clean energy plan, the energy efficiency and renewable portfolio standard that is Senate Bill 3. All of these things have cost drivers behind them, and they impact rates and customers. We've also had a greater awareness of how these things are impacting the vulnerable customers who are out there, and I consider both low income and elderly in that group. These cost drivers are going to have to be dealt with in terms or through a prism of looking at how they impact low income and elderly customers. And then we have other customers who are looking for greater choice and autonomy from the utility, some of which want to be able to see how they use power independent of getting information from the utility, how they can control their usage and respond to the data that may be available, whether they're a self-generation or an incumbent utility customer or provider in terms of a net metering customer or a larger distributed generation owner. And one last thing I want to mention is that these things are happening in an environment without legislative change. Kara talked about performance-based rate-making mechanisms, but in North Carolina, the law has not changed yet. So what we are looking at is still through a traditional vertically integrated cost of service-based rate design approach. And until the law changes, that's what the public staff continues to pursue. This next slide talks about some basic principles behind this comprehensive study, and I really bummed them off of the Regulatory Assistant Project document, as mentioned there on the slide. These principles are very high-level principles to give our commission and the utilities some guidance, but not necessarily to be able to dictate what happens in this study. I think stakeholders need an opportunity to have a vigorous discussion about what these things mean. Whether it's forward-looking, whether it's based on the usage and how price-sensitive you want to make that usage, how simple they might be and understandable for customers, because I think we need to keep in mind most customers want to be left alone when it comes to utility service. How we recover those costs in proportion to how customers use the system And then the biggest one probably is how dynamic these rates are going to be. There's a difference between those who want real sophisticated 15-minute interval data versus somebody who does not and just wants to pay a monthly bill. The objectives of this study are fairly straightforward. We need to look at how costs are incurred to connect customers. And I put this here because prior to dealing with electricity service, I dealt with water and sewer rate designs. And one of the key questions we had was the dilemma or the issue between extending service to new customers and having existing customers have to pay for some of that new capacity. Those connection costs are big drivers to utility service. Paying in proportion to usage does not mean decoupling at this time. As I mentioned, the legislature does not give, in the public staff's opinion, utilities the ability to come in periodically, whether it's monthly, semi-annual, or annually, to adjust their revenues. They have to file a rate case. But one of the things that this is doing, and the reason rate design is important, is that the load shapes, the information behind the load shapes and how costs are being incurred is something that we may be able to look at decoupling individual rates. Net metering is another issue. The fixed cost recovery is another issue, not necessarily a decoupling issue, but fixed costs are a part of utility service. We need to understand that there are costs and there are benefits for both consumers and users who provide to the incumbent utility various services by having their distributed generation. There needs to be a recognition of that. And then the last one is we need to have fair rates. We need to minimize the subsidies that are there already and to compensate the suppliers for the benefits they provide both to the system. And let me also say that this does not necessarily mean that the existing rate structures are inadequate. They need to be looked at. They may be appropriate for continuing in their present form, but I don't want anyone to feel like that we are implying that they are inadequate. This comprehensive rate study is not going to be an easy thing. It's going to be stakeholder driven. We are looking at things in the cost of service, which rate design is predicated on, the appropriateness of the customer classes, the functionalization and classification of costs, because rate design is going to have to respond to that, whether it's firm or non-firm service. We've heard over the years various residential and non-residential customers who want certain levels of service, and there may be an opportunity in rate design to address that. Marginal versus embedded cost drivers, the fixed cost recovery question I mentioned earlier. Somewhere I believe I read a question or heard a comment, but the unbundling of rates into its various components, the production, transmission, distribution, customer, fuel, and energy components of rates. There may be some opportunity to do that and to look at rate designs that help us. Dynamic pricing designs, from the simple time of use on and off peak to something more real-time pricing that gives customers the ability to respond. And then lastly, the affordability of all of this and how the cost of service is going to be determined, and then really what policies are we going to promote and adopt that would essentially shift those costs away from the more vulnerable customers. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of the where we are today, what we're trying to do under the auspices of the statute and regulatory frameworks we have today. And if there are any questions or if anybody would like further details about this, please give me a call or email me. But otherwise, I'm going to pass it to Heather.
Thanks, Jack. All right, I am going to close us out today, and I will move a little quickly so we can make sure we have some time for questions. But I'm Heather House, and I'm with Rocky Mountain Institute. I am a senior associate, and I split my time between working with cities on renewable energy and leading the North Carolina energy regulatory process. So this is coming full circle back from what Kara started today on with performance-based regulation, and wanted to let y'all know, aside from all of the examples that she listed out, what's happening in the state of North Carolina. And as Jack said, the public staff right now is operating within current statute, within the current regulatory system, and so there are stakeholder processes going on exploring how that system can be changed, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. As many of you are likely aware, the North Carolina Governor, Roy Cooper, issued Executive Order 80 that directed the Department of Environmental Quality to develop a clean energy plan for the state of North Carolina. This plan basically encouraged the utilization of clean energy resources and also the integration of those resources to facilitate a modern and resilient grid. It was recommended to work with partners across the state, including businesses, industries, power providers, residents, local governments, and more. And that process happened in 2019 and took 4 main methods of incorporating feedback, including facilitated workshops, listening sessions, online input, and others. And that included a variety of participants and contributors, upward to 800 that actually did provide input on the clean energy plan. And ultimately, that plan was submitted to the governor on October 1st of 2019. So since then, what has happened is within the utility incentives and comprehensive system planning recommendations from the Clean Energy Plan, there was the B1 recommendation, which you'll see here at the top, which recommended to launch a North Carolina energy regulatory process with representatives from key stakeholder groups to design policies that align regulatory incentives and processes with 21st century public policy goals, customer expectations, utility needs, and technology innovation. So that has happened, and that launched in February of this year and has been going on throughout the year. That process is called the North Carolina Energy Regulatory Process, which you'll hear me refer to as NERP. And what I will also highlight before moving on is the B2 recommendation here also encouraged the use of pilot programs or other methods for testing and evaluating components of a performance-based regulatory framework, which is really why I'm here today, to connect the dots. So quickly, the purpose and objectives of this process. The purpose of this process was to produce recommendations for policy and regulatory changes that could be delivered to the North Carolina Governor, the General Assembly, or the Utilities Commission. And the objectives of this process were threefold. One was to build trust and expertise among North Carolina energy stakeholders and do that through shared principles, foundation setting, education, and identification of priority action areas. The identification of priority action areas happened earlier this year, which I'll get into a little more here in a second. And then also examine alternatives to traditional utility regulatory models and incentives. And then sort of lastly, to produce policy proposals that participants and stakeholders in this process can work to implement. And so in the beginning of this process, back in February, all of the stakeholders came together and identified the outcomes that would be desirable from this process which you'll see all on the right side. And then on the left side, we bucketed that into categories. They basically fell into 4: improving customer value, improving utility regulation, improving environmental quality, and also conducting a quality stakeholder process. 3 of those were identified as top priorities, including affordability, carbon reduction, and then aligning regulatory incentives with cost control and policy goals. So those have been sort of the foundation for all of the work that has happened throughout this year. I won't go into this into detail, but wanted to let you know that this has been a very intensive process. The stakeholders have been engaged in workshops and webinars and have developed study groups to explore various reforms. And we have 1 workshop remaining where the study groups will be presenting their final outputs and kind of narrowing in and zooming in on what those outputs are. I'm only going to talk about 1 today, but wanted to let you know everything on the table. There is going to be reforms around wholesale market that will be recommended, also around competitive procurement and asset retirement. But the connection to today is really the reforms around performance-based regulation. And this group is looking at providing a guidance document, a very detailed guidance document that will describe the key findings from their work over the last 6 months and some options for the Commission to deliberate on. They are also drafting legislative language, which, as Jack said, the public staff is confined by current statute, and so they're exploring how they can amend that to adopt PBR guidance and rules. That will be supplemented by a fact sheet and then also case studies. And so I just wanted to bring this full circle here so you all could know what was going on in the state of North Carolina and what's real and how this state is actually looking at, as Jack said, sort of driving to modernize the electric utility system. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over so it can be opened up to questions. Thanks.
Great. At this point, we'd like to take just a couple minutes. We only have a few minutes to answer some of the questions that's come in today. We may not have time to answer all the questions, so we may follow up with you separately after the webinar. So we had a few questions that came in around decoupling, and I'm going to try to combine it into one and have Kara answer it. And one was, does decoupling lead to or require grid vertical segregation, the separation of generation, transmission, distribution? And then what would be some steps for that for regulators to consider? And can you mention any states that may have done this?
Sure. Thanks, Cece. So, no, decoupling does not require segregation of generation, distribution, and transmission. The design of decoupling is not universally applied. So different states and different utilities have different structures for their decoupling mechanisms. And so one of the key decisions that regulators will need to make are what costs are actually covered by decoupling. Is it going to cover generation costs? Is it going to cover distribution costs? What have you? But I wouldn't say that it necessarily requires sort of restructuring or any sort of segregation in terms of utility ownership of those different parts of the system. And along with sort of deciding what costs decoupling cover, there are also other decisions that need attention in terms of whether or not those established revenue requirements are frozen or whether or not they're actually adjusted without full rate cases. A lot of states also decide to put caps on rate adjustments. So in order to protect ratepayers from really volatile rates, there'll be some sort of cap. And in order to sort of move regulators or a state in that direction, I think there's this great opportunity to really look at other states' historical experience with decoupling. There's a lot of studies out there, a lot of studies by the Regulatory Assistance Project that looks at these states who have had decoupling for a number of years and show, how rates were adjusted. Most of them I've seen really only are adjusted within 2 to 3%, but also looking at sort of utility investment in energy efficiency, distributed energy resource programs, also sort of key indicators, right, of the value or success decoupling can bring. And so states across the U.S. Have used decoupling from, California and Oregon and Washington on the West Coast to the Midwest. There's utilities in Minnesota, Illinois who have decoupling, and then also on the East Coast. And North Carolina has decoupling actually for their gas utility also. So there's an example right here at home. But if I did not answer your question, feel free to reach out to me. You can find my email online.
Thanks, Kara. Yeah, so that's all the questions that we're going to have time to answer today. But if we got your question in the chat, we will follow up with you. Some of you we've been able to answer directly. There was a couple people that asked about the slides. So this whole presentation is pre-recorded and will be available on our Smart Grid website. And I'd like to take a moment to thank our communications team led by Christy Brudd for their incredible support this year to make our series a success. We've been producing virtual events for years, but this year we've reached record numbers of registrations for these events. And I will end today's webinar by sharing our participation satisfaction survey. Please help us improve by filling out this survey so we can continue to provide valuable information to you. We're grateful that you chose to take time out of your day to join us, and we hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.